Welcome to the podcast of the Wizarding School for Composers. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph SOWA, and as a composer and educated, I've seen firsthand how transformative the right tools and ideas can be for creative growth. Join us each episode as we demystify the craft of composition with accomplished guests and explore new approaches to enhance your creativity, productivity, and joy. Whether you're a seasoned composer or just starting out, this podcast is for you. Let's get started. My guest today is Jennet Ingle. Jennet is a performing oboist who maintains a thriving portfolio career as a reed maker, / entrepreneur, / educator, / podcaster, / author, / coach. In her business, Jennet Ingle Reeds, she sells over 200 handmade reeds per month to oboists across the country. She serves the Oboe community with her video series, The 5-Minute Reed Maker, and her weekly online Reed Club, as well as numerous programs supporting adult oboists at all levels. Her book, The Happiest Musician, tells her story and encourages creatives to take agency in their own careers, and she talks with musicians doing exactly that on her podcast, Crushing Classical. Jennet, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Joseph.
Yeah, no, it's a blast. We've known each other now for what, like a couple years? Yeah,
in Jennifer Rosenfeld's coaching programs, plural, we both seem to keep coming back for more, and why ever wouldn't we?
Yeah, no, I mean, Jennifer does an amazing job. And I think it's been really fun too, like following along with, all of your slashes, this portfolio career that you've put together. I've been really impressed with all of the things that you're doing. So it's exciting to have a time now and to get to introduce you to the people that I know and the things that you do.
I am thrilled to talk about anything you would like.
Cool. Well, let's dive in on the deep end. This is a podcast for composers, and I know that you've premiered a lot of new works. What are some of the highlights of the pieces that you've premiered, and why does collaborating with composers to make new music, why does that interest you?
I feel like classical music has this reputation as being very stuffy, as being very dead, as being very museum quality in both the good and the bad aspects of that there's an idea that classical music is about stuffy old white people playing music by dead old white people. And that is not the way that I see this industry at all, not from within it, because I, for example, am alive, and so are all of my friends and colleagues. And if we are going to continue to have an art form that is vibrant in any way, we absolutely must be helping new music to be born into the world. Music that reflects our actual time that we actually live in, and music that reflects ourselves and our hopes and dreams and the things that we love and want to do. So yes, it is absolutely important for me to bring new music into the world and to perform new music. It's more interesting too. It feels a little more aligned with me as a living human.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, what makes it more interesting for you?
I feel like if I'm preparing a classical era work, I have to start by putting on my sort of metaphorical powdered wig. I have to start by assembling the costume and knowing that when I am playing a work of classical era music, there's a certain kind of sound that I'm going to make. There's a certain kind of dynamic range that I'm going to do. And of course, the oboe has only this much dynamic range, really. And so I'm going to go from the softest to the loudest always, but there's an edge to a true fortissimo that you're never going to play in Mozart. And there's breathy kind of almost not even there at all kind of pianissimo that you're never going to get to in Mozart. When you're playing Mozart, any of those dudes, we're always thinking about, okay, where is the dissonance? Let's go lean into the dissonance and lean out again. Let's keep everything in this sort of very courtly mode. Let's be really cognizant of 3. That is where I'm headed all the time. And it's not that I don't like that. It's beautiful. It's lovely, and it's fun to do anything really well at a high level. But ultimately, no matter how expressive I am and how expressive I feel in my body, and how I do believe and advocate that once I have that powdered wig on and once I have that classical era costume on, I can still express human music, right? That is why it has stood the test of time. That's why it's magical. But, I don't always want to have that powdered wig on. Sometimes I just want to be 21st century Jennet with my glasses and my Zoom sweatpants. And also still get to express who I am and what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. And as you've been doing that, what have been some of the highlights of that? Of different, maybe one or two different collaborations that have stood out to you that have just been this collaboration was a ton of fun?
Well, just recently, just last year, in my Flow program, we commissioned composer Kincaid Rabb to write for adult amateur oboists. And so I'm saying this I don't have permission to play any of these little movements yet, because they were written for my students, my participants, the people that I am teaching. And it was an absolute thrill to bring this music into the world. As Kincaid and I talked, the composer and I, we had both just attended the International Double Reed Society conference back in Boulder, Colorado last summer. And, I gave a recital there and I played some new pieces and all of that was fantastic. And Kincaid was there and had a work premiered. But their reaction to the conference as a whole is, wow, there's just a lot of very hard music getting composed and premiered. And where is the music that the layman, the person who isn't actually a professional, can get behind and can dig into and can really play and make beautiful music with? Where is the brand new work that is accessible to more humans than just those who have gone to conservatory and then also had a 20-year career? And that was exciting to me too. So we created this work. It's called Epiphanies. It has 11 movements, and there's about to be a 12th because Kincaid's writing one for me as well. And it's going to be published and released later this year. But meanwhile, we, in my Flow program, spent the entire year developing the concept for each movement with the composer, and then learning each of their movements and figuring out how to engage with this new harmonic language that was not familiar to some of them, with these interesting shifting meters that were not familiar to some of them. These were challenging in the right way for most of them, and happened to be really beautiful, beautiful works as well. So that's a recent highlight that really thrills me, is this work that we created for my oboe community. Should I go on? I have another one too.
I think just first, I'm just going to comment on that before we get to the other one. I think that's just such a cool collaboration, just because, like you said, so many composers end up being focused on, how can I write something that's cutting edge and challenging and difficult? And it's well, if you write something that is for, like you said, more accessible for more players, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to dumb the music down. It just means that more people can play it.
Exactly, because there's a difference between writing baby music for babies and writing excellent, well-constructed, well-crafted music that doesn't happen to be all that oboistically difficult.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. I have a whole bunch of questions for you about writing for the oboe that we'll get to. But I'm curious, you mentioned that there is another one that you're excited about.
I mean, there is another piece that I commissioned just before the pandemic from a local composer here in South Bend. And it's a 3-movement work based on the tarot, which I'm a super fan of the tarot cards. And we met together a whole bunch of times. We drew a bunch of different cards and different combinations and thought about what they might mean and looked at the imagery and talked a lot about how we might translate the art and the beauty and the message of these cards into actual music. And the piece that came out of it, Dreams and Visions, Searching the Shadows, is a 3-movement work, 1 movement for solo oboe, 1 movement for oboe and piano, 1 movement for oboe, viola, and piano. So designed to be sort of like a triptych. The movements are performable individually or together. And all of this was discussed between me and the composer when we began the collaboration. And then, what's so surprising is it didn't turn out anything like I imagined. It was completely different, because it turns out that even if you, I'm learning this right now, Joseph, and I know you know this already, but this was the first time that I was like the commissionee, that's not right, commissioner, the person who was putting the money down. Like I got some grants and so forth, and who was saying what it was I wanted. It still turns out that the piece that emerges didn't come out of my brain. Of course it came out of Marjorie's brain. And it's a work now that exists that is playable by oboists. I've had some students look at it also. That wasn't in the repertoire before, and now it is. I've performed it a whole bunch of times. It's been a tremendous, great pleasure. And also, it's nothing like I imagined. And like that's sort of the surprise and the excitement and the joy of it. And also, it's just really interesting.
Yeah, I think the thing that stood out to me about it, I mean, so there's this element of like, you're talking a lot about this piece and then it comes out as a surprise. But what stood out to me as you're describing the commissioning process is just how much you and Marjorie talked about this piece as you were doing it and drawing all these cards. It seems to me like that would be another element, and you mentioned a similar sort of thing with Kincaid, is that the great thing about working with living composers is that they're alive, and so you get to have relationships and friendships with them.
Yes, and just like any relationship and any friendship, like I don't get to be the boss of it, right? Within my collaborations with other performing artists, I don't expect that I get my way every minute. And in my collaboration or relationship with my, say, husband, it's not the case that I get my way in every aspect. And it was just sort of a learning for me. That is the case also when you commission things, and that's the point. Because if I wanted exactly the thing that was in my mind, I should have composed it myself, which I am not actually capable of doing. And I'm sure you have ways to tell me that I am actually, but because that's your thing. But that's not the way I think my creativity lies.
Yeah, no, and that's totally fair. That's totally fair. I think it'd be interesting. It'd be a different sort of creative process, because there is a sort of creative process where, like the one that you had with Kincaid or with Marjorie, where you're like, these are the parameters, let's make something happen. I could also envision a creative process of, someone working more as like an amanuensis of just like, I want this very specific thing. And then you can like turn around and have a creative process with them. We're like, oh yeah, that isn't exactly the scale that I want, or I was thinking of a different sort of rhythm. I mean, that's possible. I just don't hear composers and performers doing that sort of thing that often.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like in tiny ways that dynamic has emerged in sort of an editorial way with both of those commissions, and with another actually that I worked on with Doug Lofstrom back in 2007, where he wrote a concertino for oboe and orchestra that I got to premiere. And like there's an element by which once I have the music in my hot little hands and I start to work on it, I can go back to the composer and say, hey, this one thing, here's what it actually sounds like, and I don't think that lies well for the oboe. Is there anything we can do here? Or I wish that, like, I love this line where I'm like heading up and up and up and up and up, and I want to go just a little bit further before I turn around. Is that possible? I have no idea how you as a composer feel about that kind of conversation. Everyone has been very gracious with me when I say it to them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's great to have that kind of conversation. I mean, that's the kind of, for me, I like that kind of collaboration with performers. Another thing that I love as well in collaborating with performers is just that, like, I of course bring my own musicality to whatever it is that I'm writing, but, working with someone like you, or even I'd imagine working with one of your students, is that, musicians are musical. And so they're going to have like musical intuition and musical ideas that, fill in the sort of blind spots, or, whether this is something like technical, obviously you're going to know what suits the oboe better than what I would. But even like that last example that you mentioned where it's like, oh, this thing is going up and I wish it would go up a little bit further. Like, I think that it's great that you're able to bring in your musical intuition and just being able to collaborate with a composer in that way too.
Yeah, and it's really exciting actually, because like I could think all day that I want let's use Mozart again, to like do just something a little bit different in his concerto there in the third movement there. But I can never ask him to rewrite something that he has written. It is only my job to take what I am given on the page and deliver it with a combination of me inside it and Mozart on the outside of it. Again, my powdered wig, but then my own musical ideas. And that is also the case if I'm looking at a new work by a composer that I do not have a personal relationship with, right? I see my instructions on the page. My first job is to understand what is being asked of me and like what are the notes and rhythms and how does this fit together? And then my second job is, okay, now what do I think about it and believe about it and feel about it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, as we're talking about this idea of like, how is it that composers and performers collaborate with each other? I remember this story. I don't know if you've heard this. So when Barbra Streisand was recording Send in the Clowns by Stephen Sondheim, do you know that recording?
Yes, it's on her Broadway album, right?
Yeah, it's a fantastic recording. Love Barbra Streisand. But when she was recording this song, they originally only had 2 verses, and she goes to Stephen Sondheim and she's just like, there's a verse that's missing here. There's something that needs to be added to this song. And, Sondheim thinks about it and he's like, you know what? She's right. This does need another verse. And so I think that's, to my mind, an example of the kind of thing of what you're saying, where like, performers, you've spent all of these years mastering your instrument and performing in front of audiences. It's like you have great musical intuition for things like that.
I mean, I hope so. And
yeah, that's the whole. I mean, we're not all Barbra Streisand, but I mean, we all have something to contribute, though. So
yes, absolutely, including my fabulous studio of adult amateurs who like are not for the most part out playing in professional orchestras and having long careers as oboists. They have had like actual long careers doing actual like grown-up work. And they're coming back to the oboe as, at the point in their lives where they have time to do so. And some of them would say, oh yeah, I'm just trying to figure this out. I really feel like a beginner. But they all have opinions about how the music goes. No one is laying down notes a la MIDI.
Yeah, well, thankfully.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to pivot now into some like writing for oboe things. Something that I've been thinking about, and I've seen some of these books, I'm not sure that composers are aware that they exist, is you have books of these are the orchestral repertoire passages, right? Of like all of the solos that you need to know when you're taking auditions in different places. And so I'm just going to start out with a basic question. We're just going to go from there. If you had to pick like, a couple of the different oboe solos from the literature, what would you say was like one that's like, man, this is the one that always like ties your fingers and tongue in knots, and then one that's like your favorite thing to play on the oboe?
Yeah. So, what's interesting is that most of the things that used to tie my fingers in knots and go and have me say, oh, why do I even play this instrument, have become the things that are among my favorite things to play.
Interesting.
By nature of playing them over and over again and continuing to work on them and then having experiences playing them in the actual orchestra, which is infinitely more fun in every case than playing them for an audition committee behind a screen. Yeah, I look, for example, at the little solo in the second movement of La Mer, which is up in our third octave, like cross fingerings all over the place, and it's in 3/8, but it's kind of written like with a beat pattern across the line and in the play of the waves movement. You want me to sing it at you?
Yeah, sure. Let's hear it.
The one that goes, and excellent.
I'm with you. I hope that our audience is with you, but I'm with you. I know what you're talking about.
Great, super.
Yeah.
So, it's actually very cumbersome under the fingers, and it's written in 4 or 5 sharps, and it's up, again, in the third octave of the oboe, where none of the fingerings make sense anymore, because they're all just, sort of bastardized harmonic versions of lower notes with extra keys thrown on them. And It's written in like 16th notes and like triplets across the bar. Like it's messy. And when I first encountered that in college and then like had to play it for auditions, and then it moves into like fast tonguing. It's a mess. It's so tricky. It absolutely is one of my favorite things to play now. I've played La Mer plenty of times, and it's so cool the way all of the that comes out of the flute right before yadam bum bum yadam bum bum yadam bum bum, and which is just a slightly slower statement of the same thing that I'm about to play. And then I'm up in this terrific register of the oboe. It's hard to play, but it actually cuts really well. And it feels triumphant, and it feels like just an extra big wave or like the spray over the ocean. And it is absolutely no trouble getting heard, even though there's still all of this sort of surging stuff going on elsewhere in the orchestra, because it sits so high and comfortable. And there's something about which is really just fun to do once you get your fingers around it. I don't even know if I'm answering your question, Joseph. Now I'm just like waxing rhapsodic about Debussy.
Well, I mean, it's not hard to wax rhapsodic about Debussy. So this would be on your list of passages that a composer should know of. Like, this is one of the classic oboe solos.
Yeah, it is. In that it shows up on every audition, even though most of us don't get to play it until later, because youth orchestras don't do La Mer for the most part.
No surprise there. Yeah, well, okay, well, maybe then let's like circle around to like an easier one. What is an oboe solo that like you might actually see in a youth orchestra, or that, you know, one of your amateur students would feel more comfortable playing?
How about like Scheherazade with
Yeah, so what is it about that makes it particularly oboistic?
Well, first of all, the oboe's the second person to get to play that melody in that movement, and we are the ones who give tempo and momentum to it, whereas the bassoon who comes first just like meanders through it. The oboe who brings it in gets to sort of purr through. A lot of like tension, release, which is really good for us. We get to... It's a long solo, so there are a number of opportunities for us to breathe, but there are also a number of opportunities for us to choose not to breathe and be just like a little bit jockey about how long we can go without breathing. So, like going ahead and eliding a line that one might have chosen to breathe in, because we don't have to, and it's more fun that way. It gives us a lot of playfulness.
Well, I want to pull out a couple of points that I'm hearing from this, and, you know, get your take on this. So if we're going to like make a ranking of like has to breathe the most versus has to breathe the least, oboes win for has to breathe the least. Totally, right?
Yes, but we can only do that selectively. Like, I can start a piece and I can give you the first 20 bars without a breath, but I cannot also then give you the next 20 bars without a breath, or the next 40. I can play a phrase longer than anybody else in the orchestra, but the problem with the oboe is we collect all of the bad air inside us, and if we are not given enough time to the carbon dioxide that is built up, we'll then like fall to the floor and die.
Okay, well, we don't want that.
No! So yes, really long phrases, but with spaciousness.
Okay, yeah, that's really cool. So, I mean, if I were to finish out the ranking, oboe wins, and then maybe clarinet, and then human voice, and then flute. Like, flute, I'd imagine, has, because you're losing so much air when you're playing flute.
Correct. Flutes can barely sustain lines. And I say that knowing fantastic flute players in my life who can play for what sounds like an inhuman amount of time. Like, they're great. But they will always lose to oboists and probably to vocalists.
Yeah. So, all right. I'm understanding things good. This is great. I had one more passage I want to ask you about, just because this is one that I've seen brought up as this is a tricky passage in the oboe, and I'm curious to hear from an oboist. What do you think about this passage? Namely, the opening of Le Tombeau by Ravel. What's tricky about this?
One of the first things that is tricky about it is that because it all lives under slurs, and because oboe fingerings are complicated and cumbersome, it is always easy for us to rush or get really lumpy underneath slurs. Like, if it were tongued, even our tongue would be able to keep the fingers organized, but because it's with only occasional articulation, our fingers tend to run. So rushing through it, especially in the B section, is an enormous problem for many oboists. It runs because there's nothing to hold it back and keep it safe, namely an articulation. The other mess of it is, especially when the prime section comes back and we're down, starting on F sharp and going down to low B, we've got all these awkward cross fingerings, and the lowest register of the oboe is sluggish to respond, might tend to honk or quack. People get scared down there. If the instrument is out of adjustment at all, which they often are, the low B and the low C sharp won't really speak, and so you end up with beetle, beetle, or worse, where it really honks out. It's a little awkward to articulate at the end because it's on an F sharp, which is a note that looks mid-range but actually is low on the oboe. So when you tongue hard on it, it kind of wants to explode. Let's see. You'd perhaps like me to generalize this a little bit better.
No. This is great. These are all the details that I've known that was a tricky passage, but I didn't know exactly why that was a tricky passage. And so hearing all of the different specific notes, I think is fascinating. I'm going to actually just editorialize a little bit here and just kind of go a little bit meta on this thing. So, I appreciate hearing all these different passages and hearing how it is as a performer that you're thinking about these passages. And I think it's really cool how articulate you are about these are all of the micro details about, this particular note and this particular aspect of it. Because when composers learn how to write for the different instruments, the Samuel Adler textbook is the classic textbook, of course. There are other resources. I don't know if you know of Indiana University's Instrumental Studies for Eyes and Ears. It's this website where it shows you a recording of someone playing the thing, and then it shows you the notation, and then there's commentary that's going along with what's happening that you see on screen. And so you get to see it, and you get to see the person play it and see the notation and then see the description of, what it's like in that register and things. But I feel like a website like ISFI can only do so much, which is why talking to you or talking to another oboist or just instrumentalist generally about what are the specific passages in your repertoire and what makes them easier to play and what makes them hard to play? That's not necessarily something that you're going to get from an orchestral textbook. For instance, Walter Piston talks about that Ravel excerpt for a little bit, but he doesn't explain it nearly as thoroughly or with as much insight as you just did then. So, which is kind of why I was asking you this question of just tell me more about this repertoire. Because it's yeah, we can talk about writing in oboe in general. Other people have did that. I just think it's fascinating about being okay, well, what's actually going on with these famous passages for oboe?
I don't know if this is interesting or not, but when when I'm working with someone or myself, and we're struggling with any one specific passage that just feels terrible under the fingers or a note won't speak in it or something is just amiss, a thing we will often do, that I will often encourage, is to just take the thing up a fifth or up a third or up an octave and put it someplace totally different on the oboe so that you can have the experience of dealing with a different set of problems, because every register of the oboe is problematic in different ways. But the low B to C sharp mess and the F sharp thing that I talked about just a second ago in the Tombeau de Couperin, or the rushy diddly 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 diddly, which rushes because it's too easy right there, kind of, under the fingers. If you put it someplace totally different on the oboe, it gives you a different understanding of what the music is that you're trying to create. Like once isn't the problem anymore, because in a different register you can just sort of noodle it, then you're like, oh, I see. So really, we're just playing this the third lower. It makes more musical sense when we come back to it, if our mind is not, oh god, there comes that B and C sharp thing, oh god, there comes that F sharp thing again, but rather, oh, here comes that return of that phrase, just a third lower. I understand what is musically happening here, and it's less intimidating now. And then, of course, we work it back to where it goes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting rehearsal hack. That's very cool. Well, I'm looking over some of these questions that I have. I think I want to take this in somewhat of a different direction. We've been talking a lot about like working with composers, what it's like to do commissions, writing for oboe. Among your many slashes, you're also a career coach, and you've had this very multifaceted career. How do you find balance between these different roles and how they complement each other?
I struggle with that every single day, Joseph, honestly. But as I'm thinking about the different things that I do, the teaching, the coaching, the creating content for my business, the making of the reads for my business, and like showing up and performing myself. When I'm thinking about balance, I really am thinking about my energy over the course of a day and doing my very best to put the things where they need to go. So an entire day or two might pass that I don't actually practice the oboe at all, because that is not as urgent in a given week as creating emails or making a new video for my channel or something else. Days might pass that I don't do any writing because I'm more engaged with actually playing the oboe and working on a new piece, working on a new concert, working on something else that's happening. But one thing that I'm really aware of for myself is that by the end of the day, I don't have a lot left in me. So like by 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, if I am not at a rehearsal, I want to be sitting at my desk like working on reads, because that is something I can do while brain dead, and that is something I can do while watching internet television. And that's where my energy is at that point in the day. Whereas if I need to like write something, if I need to create something, I know for myself that I am best for that in the morning, so I try to leave my mornings really open. I guess, what is my point here? That managing all of my slashes has really been about tracking what I have energy for and how much space I need between things in order to have the right for it. Because if I'm going to show up on Zoom and speak or coach or teach or like have a lovely podcast conversation like this one with you, I need to be present for that. I can't be 9 o'clock p.m. me who really only wants to watch Grey's Anatomy. It needs to be a better version of me. So, like, I need space before that, a half an hour before, an hour before, so that I can close my eyes or step outside and take a walk or do something to, like, clear the last thing away. And so a ton of what I think about in terms of my business and my scheduling is I'm just always thinking about how could I do this better. If I get to the end of a lesson that I'm teaching and I feel like I haven't said anything really intelligent, I'll sort of backtrack and think, okay, well, what was I doing this morning that I don't have good quality to give this person right now? And how can I do it better tomorrow? Because I want to bring as much quality as I can to everything I do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's it's an important insight because, oboists such as yourself, we aren't the only people that have these portfolio careers. Do you know Garrett Hope, for instance?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so Garrett, of course, has this podcast that's literally called The Portfolio Composer. And if you're going to be a professional musician and not work for a university or some sort of institution, your career is probably going to look a lot like yours, where you're going to be wearing a whole bunch of hats. And so I think that this idea of managing the energy, that's like my main takeaway that I'm getting from this, is managing your energy is the best way that you can balance these different roles.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for different people, it's allowed to look different. I know people who like have to have a 3-hour block blocked off in order to do creative work. Like in order to sit down and write a chapter of their book or write a blog post or whatever it is that they're trying to create, the next commission that they're creating for somebody else. They need to have a huge amount of time. And that is not a thing that I have found works for me. I actually like to be busy. I like to be sort of roaming through my day. But what I do need is to have a really clear intention about it and have some time allotted for it. I might not be making a ton of sense, but because I'm really pretty comfortable at this point with how I work, sitting in front of a computer for 3 hours is not the answer. But having a morning that is pretty free so that I can go for a run, eat some breakfast, maybe play the oboe a little bit, be thinking about the thing I'm going to write, maybe play the oboe a little bit more, maybe have some more coffee, and then when the inspiration hits, I can sort of waft back over to the computer, sit for half an hour, and knock something out that then later, with a different kind of energy, I can edit. It sort of sounds like I don't do anything in my days, and that's not really true at all. But
Yeah, well, no, that's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is that, like, you're a creative person, and like, in my day, and I guess what I see is that there's the thing that you are deliberately consciously doing, and then but through doing that thing, there's the space and the energy that you're creating for your unconscious, right? And so when I hear you being like, yeah, I go on a run, drink coffee, I play some oboe, maybe do something different, and all the while you're like thinking about this thing, and you're just sort of like floating back and forth. You're giving your unconscious permission and space to make the connections that make it easy, that when you finally sit down at your computer, you can just go plunk, 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 done.
Yes, exactly. And I like how beautifully and articulately you described that, because that's exactly what it is. If I am sitting in front of my computer looking at the blank cursor, nothing will happen forever except that I will get angrier and angrier. But if I only come to the computer once the idea hits, and everything else I'm doing is not unproductive, but is like sort of putting me in the headspace of waiting for that thing to hit.
Yeah, cultivating the right energy and like having that intention there such that it can rise to the surface when it's ready. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Well, let's get a little bit more specific for composers. So in your book, The Happiest Musician, you encourage creatives to take agency in their careers. Could you maybe share a couple of practical tips or strategies that composers could use to assert that kind of control in their artistic journeys?
Well, do you feel like there are composers who sort of wait around for someone to reach out and commission them?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
100%, yeah.
That doesn't feel very agency-like. So one thing that I talk about often with my little mastermind group is making sure that your taxi light. So if you've been to New York, you can't just flag down any taxi cab. You have to wait for the one that is actually illuminated and looks like they're accepting passengers. So what might that look like for you? It might look like having a really clear, visible page on your website that is like, here is how you can reach out to me to commission, and here are sort of an approximate menu of my rates. It might look like having a social media presence where you're like, I just finished this fantastic piece for such and such a person, and I'm really proud of it, and I have a little bit of opening in my schedule now if anyone is looking for work to be commissioned. It might look like the conversation that I had with Kincaid right after the IDRS convention, where we just touched base as a conversation. I wasn't thinking about commissioning anything. We were just talking because I reached out to congratulate them on the premiere that they had done. And we had a conversation, and during the course of it, they said, look, I've always wanted to write something for amateurs. And I said, I have amateurs in a room with me every other week. What could we do together? But just like placing that idea into the space. The fact that we were on a call at all happened because I met them in an elevator and we exchanged business cards, which, I had to look around for mine. It wasn't like I was carrying them to hand out, but I had them, and Kincaid had them, and made that exchange happen. So reaching out intentionally to people that you think you might like to work with, whether that is an immediate idea that you have for them right this minute, or just a contact that you're hoping to cultivate because in the future you would like to work with them. Being in conversation with other human beings in which don't fear to say, oh, I'm a composer. I do things like this.
Yeah, I love this. I think this is fabulous. And, as a performer, I think something that composers are often nervous about is they, worry about coming on too strong or about, I think that we hear as composers all these other things. Many composers often don't have great social skills. But there's this fear that, oh no, like if I mention commission or I mention the composing thing or heaven forbid I bring up the idea of money, that there's this idea that's somehow sort of off-putting, and then you just sort of tie yourself up in knots where it's just like you just can't do the kind of thing of what you're saying. And so I guess my follow-up question would be, how would you feel if a composer were to approach you? I mean, you kind of already told that story about Kincaid. How would you feel if that composer were to approach you and just like, tell me more about your oboe stuff, Jennet? I write music. What do you feel about that sort of thing?
I mean, I find it nothing but flattering that someone would approach me with an idea. It doesn't obligate me to say yes, but a conversation is always interesting. I feel like so many of us, like I run online programs as well. Like we all get a little anxious about being salesy. Like, ooh, who do I think I am? Indicating that I accept money for things. But we all do that. That is why we work. We work to make money. And if our work is creative work, that doesn't mean that it's not work that is worthy of. So, yes, there is probably a version of it that is too strong. There is probably a version of, oh, you're an oboist? I have a piece for oboe. I would like to write a piece for oboe. Like, there's a version of it that comes on too strong, but I don't think it's, I don't think the line is at, oh, let's have a conversation. Maybe someday we'd like to collaborate. Like, oh, that's really interesting, that thing you said. I've had something in my mind that I've been wanting to write. Might you ever be interested in talking about a commission? Like, none of that is offensive.
I think that's great. I mean, I'd want people to just bookmark this and just like, these are the kinds of things that you can say to people. I mean, in some ways it's a little bit common sense, but it's just counterintuitive just because certainly don't teach you this in music school.
No, absolutely not. And like it's not just composers, right? Performers and musicians also tend to be like, we work alone in our little practice rooms. We just step out and see the light of day. Most people who come out of conservatory don't have the best social skills. I for sure didn't. But you get better as you go, and conversations with people where you just listen to what they have to say and then say something back in return are for sure the way to start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier than somebody might imagine, I think. Well, thanks for sharing about that. We're coming close to the hour. I want to start to wrap things up. A couple more questions for you. First off, I'm very excited. Our 2 studios are actually going to be collaborating this fall. So your flow program with all of your wonderful amateur oboists and the fall round of the Wizarding School for composers. The composers in the Wizarding School are going to be writing oboe pieces for your amateur oboists. And I just wanted to ask you, why are you excited for that collaboration? What are you looking forward to with it?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm excited to bring more music into the world. That is a given. But also, I think there's our collaboration with Kincaid last year was amazing. It was really wonderful, and the work that came out of it, I'm thrilled about, and I'm delighted that it's going to be added to the oboe repertoire. All of that, but the actual working together process was not. There was not a lot of intensive interaction. Partly it was not that well organized on my part and Kincaid's part. Partly it's just the way it was. We had 1 composer and 11 oboists, and everyone had their own ideas, but really we sort of threw all of our ideas at Kincaid and then got in a box, and a few months later we had a result. What I am really excited about is the opportunity for this upcoming collaboration of having just a little bit more interaction and a little more conversation between my oboists who, again, performers are not great at this either, who can work at articulating exactly what it is they're looking for or thinking about or working on in their own playing and what would help them and what they would love. And being able to put that in words and really work back and forth with the composer as material comes in. Say, oh, I love everything about this, but somehow this measure doesn't work for me. I can't play it. Is there something we can do? I think that having that greater level of interaction will be terrific for both sides. That's what I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that this collaborative thing would benefit composers a ton. I think it would particularly benefit composers because, the more performers that can play your music, the better. And so learning how to collaborate with good amateur performers is going to be super helpful. Actually, on that note, a composer might think to themselves, well, why would I want to write a piece for amateur level oboe? And so I'd just turn that around to you, Jennet, and ask, why would a composer want to, other than, of course, the chance to collaborate with your awesome students, why would a composer want to write a piece for amateur level oboe?
Well, I feel like a piece that is playable by a person at a pretty good moderate level of ability is going to get a lot more play than a piece that is written so that only I and that other, sorry, I was about to have a precise number of oboists in the country that could play it, and that's ridiculous. There's plenty of good oboists out there, but there's not that many oboists that's not that many oboists. And if you're already stratifying it to the top 15% of people who actually can play, then you're going to have to do a lot of work to get your piece into the hands of those people who are also already famous in their own right and might not be that interested. Whereas, if you're writing pieces that can be performed by someone who can play the oboe pretty well, that doesn't mean that that person isn't a terrific musician. It just means the oboe is hard. It doesn't mean that these fantastic players, these top 15%, are not going to be interested in playing it, because I don't have to play multiphonics instrument. I might actually prefer not to every time. I don't know why you wouldn't want to have your work exist in the world as something that is accessible to more humans. And as my very last point here, I don't think that amateur means bad. I think amateur means loving, right? It's the love of the art, the love of the music. It could be that that person isn't technically that proficient yet, but it does not mean that they're not going to be super into what you're doing and artistic and gracious.
I think that's just a wonderful place to end it on. This is why we do what we do, because we love it. And, whether we fall into that technical definition of amateur or whether we're professionals, we write music, we play music because we love it. Cool. Well, thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, as always, to chat and to get your opinions on things. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up here?
I guess just that I'm such an advocate for creative people, whether those people are musicians and performers like me and mine, writers, artists, composers, for sure. I would love to see more composers, more musicians, more artists thriving in the world, because I feel like your artistry matters. And if there is a creative project brewing inside you that you want to get out into the world, I can only encourage you to do that thing.
I love that. That's fabulous. How can people learn more about you? How can they get a hold of you if they have more questions?
Sure. I am at jennetingle.com. You can find me as the 5-Minute Readmaker on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook as Jennet Ingle Oboist. But really, if you just find jennetingle.com, you can link out to just about everything from there.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jennet, for joining us. And thanks for those out there who are listening to this. Happy music making, everybody. We'll see you later.